Ward 7C of the Military Recovery Hospital was located on the top floor of the building, where the late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows and bathed everything in a rusty gold hue. It was 1944, and the building, which had once been a luxury hotel on the coast of northeastern Brazil, had been converted into a treatment center for wounded soldiers arriving from the European theater of operations. The corridors echoed with the sound of weary footsteps, heavy breathing, and occasionally muffled cries that no one wanted to acknowledge aloud. The war had seeped into every wall, every corner, leaving marks that even white paint could not completely cover. Dr. Mateus Albuquerque was a 52-year-old man with hands that trembled slightly when he held a pen between his fingers. He had been a musician before the war, a respected composer who played piano at sophisticated soirees in big cities. But life had taught him lessons that no score could express. After losing hearing in one ear in an accident during the early years of the conflict, he had reinvented himself as a therapist, dedicating himself to understanding what traditional medicine could not achieve in those broken soldiers. His gray hair fell over his forehead, and his blue eyes carried the depth of someone who had seen too much pain to feign indifference. Every morning, Mateus arrived at the hospital before dawn. He would descend the dark wooden staircase where the sea breeze penetrated through the cracks in the windows, bringing with it the salty and invigorating smell of the ocean. In his hands, he always carried a worn leather briefcase containing old sheet music, new compositions he wrote himself during sleepless nights, and a small harmonica that had been his companion since his youth. The nurses greeted him with a respectful nod, knowing that the doctor brought something that medicine could not prescribe in any formula. The ward housed 23 men, each of them a universe of visible and invisible wounds. There was Private Cabral, who had lost both hands in an explosion at a European port and spent his days staring at the ceiling without blinking. There was Lieutenant Ferreira, whose lungs had been damaged by gas that had leaked from a storage compartment, leaving him breathing like a broken bellows. And there was also young Gomez, only 21 years old, who had been blown up inside and out by an event he refused to describe, his hands shaking uncontrollably at any unexpected sound. They were all heroes that society wanted to forget, men whose bravery had been twisted into something that popular culture did not know how to celebrate. The routine in the infirmary was rigid and predictable, like a broken metronome. The men woke up to the ringing of a bell at 6 a.m, when the nurses brought medication and eau de cologne to relieve the humid heat that settled on the coast from sunrise. Weak coffee and stale bread were served on metal trays that creaked unpleasantly. The following hours were filled with painful physical therapy, dressing wounds that still bled, and conversations with psychologists who wrote everything down in notebooks without seeming to really listen. In the afternoon came the most dreaded time, when forced inactivity left the soldiers' minds free to revisit every terrible moment they wanted to forget. It was during this period that Mateus arrived, his presence announced by the soft sound of his footsteps and the smell of cheap tobacco smoke that clung to his clothes. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue receiving exciting stories that transform lives and inspire hearts. Mateus's journey is just the beginning of a narrative that will deeply stir your emotions. In the beginning, Mateus did not practice what could be called formal therapy. He simply sat in a worm-eaten wooden chair, took his harmonica out of the pocket of the gray jacket he wore day after day, and began to play. The first notes were always the same, a simple and sad melody, almost a musical whisper that echoed through the infirmary like a friendly spirit. The soldiers used to look away or pretend to be asleep, as if the music were an unwanted intruder in their established solitude. But something changed subtly during these sessions. The tension in the men's shoulders eased imperceptibly. The hands that trembled stopped shaking for a few precious seconds. One or two soldiers ventured to open their eyes. Mateus had discovered through his own studies and experiments that it was not the technical quality of the music that mattered to these men. It was the intention that vibrated behind each note. It was the reminder that someone recognized their humanity. It was the unspoken promise that there was still something beautiful in this broken world. He did not seek praise or recognition. His reward was the first movement of a lip toward a smile. It was the tear that silently ran down the face of a man who had forgotten how to cry. It was the moment when one of those wounded soldiers whispered a word lost months ago. As the weeks passed, Mateus refined his methodology. He began to bring his old portable piano to the sessions, a short-tailed instrument with yellowed ivory keys and a sound that was more like a whisper than a musical cry. He composed pieces exclusively for each soldier he treated, observing their movements, their silences, the way their bodies reacted to different changes in tone and rhythm. Some of them began to participate actively, clapping rhythmically or even humming melodies along with him. That ward, which had been a place of silent despair, began to breathe differently, like a body that, after months of paralysis, recognized its own muscles. Mateus's reputation began to spread. Nurses working in other wards of the hospital began asking him to visit their patients as well. Doctors who had been skeptical about the effectiveness of anything other than medication began to notice significant changes in the behavior of the soldiers who received the music sessions. The hospital hired 2 more musicians and created a formal, albeit modest, music therapy program. But it was still Mateus who carried the cause forward with unwavering dedication, like a missionary who had found his true calling. The fragile peace that Mateus had built in the infirmary began to unravel in late August 1944, when Colonel Ribeiro, the hospital's medical director, received an official memo from Porto Alegre about budget restrictions. The building had received significant cuts in its resource allocations, and the military administration demanded that each expense be justified with verifiable scientific precision. Music, the memo argued, was not a formally recognized medical intervention. It was entertainment. And entertainment at that moment of war when resources were scarce was a luxury the nation could not afford. Mateus received the news clearly when Ribeiro summoned him to his office, a room that smelled of imported cigarettes and old papers. The colonel was a 60-year-old man who had lost a daughter in a bombing in Salvador, although he rarely mentioned it. His eyes carried a hardness that even medication could not soften, and his voice had the tone of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. He sat behind his dark mahogany desk, his hands folded on top of each other, as he watched Mateus enter with his sheet music and portable piano. The tension in the room was as palpable as the smell of the sea that drifted in through the side window. Ribeiro explained, with a coldness that bordered on cruelty, that the music sessions would be suspended indefinitely. There was no scientific evidence that the practice worked. Resources should be channeled into tested medications and procedures recognized by the international medical community. Mateus felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He argued as eloquently as he could, explaining that he had documented significant changes in the soldiers' behavior, that the numbers of self-harm incidents had decreased, that episodes of nighttime screaming and nightmares had been dramatically reduced since the sessions began. Ribeiro listened patiently, but his expression did not change. He knew the numbers, he replied, but numbers were not science. They were anecdotal observations. The colonel quoted a letter he had received from a colleague in São Paulo who considered music therapy a pseudo-scientific attempt to justify unnecessary expenses. Mateus left that office certain that he had lost the only battle that really mattered. The news spread through the infirmary like oil on water. The soldiers, who had begun to anticipate Mateus's visits with an almost childlike hope, fell back into a pit of despair that was even deeper than before, for now they knew the taste of improvement. Lieutenant Ferreira, whose damaged lungs condemned him to breathe with difficulty every moment of the day, stopped eating his meals. Gomes returned to uncontrollable tremors, this time worse than before. Cabral, the soldier without hands, spent 2 whole nights screaming in the dark. His eyes rolled back as if reliving every moment of the horror that had left him that way. The nurses sought out Mateus in the hospital corridors, desperately asking him to find a solution. Some of them whispered that something had broken in the soldiers when the music stopped, as if Mateus had turned on a light in a room that had been dark for years, and then simply turned it off, leaving them in darkness again. One of the older nurses, a man named Vinicius who had lost a son in the war, spoke to Mateus privately in the hospital kitchen while the sea mist drifted in through the glass windows. If this story touched your heart, click thank you, so that it reaches others who need to hear about resilience and the transformative power of compassion. What you are about to discover will transform the way you think about courage. Vinicius had tears in his eyes when he explained that he had seen real changes in these soldiers. He had seen Lieutenant Ferreira laugh for the first time in months. He had witnessed Cabral ask for paper and pencil to draw with his mouth. an activity that no one thought he would ever be able to do again. Vinicius argued that this was medicine too, just a different kind than the one recognized in official books. Matthias listened to everything with the feeling that the world was incapable of recognizing the truth when it presented itself in a way that was subtly different from what it expected. During the second week without the music sessions, the soldiers' behavior visibly deteriorated. 2 of them tried to hurt themselves in episodes of despair. 3 others refused to get out of bed, their bodies becoming inert like breathing corpses. The entire hospital seemed to be regressing to the chaotic early days, when the infirmary was a place where men came to die slowly, far from any dignity or hope. The doctors themselves began to notice the difference. Even Ribeiro, who had signed the suspension order, made an unusual inspection of the ward and saw what no one needed to explain in words. There was an overwhelming weight in the air, a sense of defeat that medications could not touch. Matthias spent those days in a silent internal struggle. He frequented the ward during his official hours, like a therapist trying to comfort with words when what his patients needed was something that no words could provide. He spent entire nights in his small apartment on the first floor of the hospital building, looking at his sheet music as if they were relics of a lost time. His hands touched the keys of the old grand piano but without producing sound, as if he were practicing ghosts of melodies he was not allowed to play. Then, one night, when the tension had reached its unbearable peak, Matthias made a discovery that devastated him as much as the initial prohibition. He was making his night rounds at the hospital as part of his official duties as a therapist, when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. It came from Ward 7 to C, from a place where no sound should have been coming from at that time of night. It was a faint musical note, almost a whisper that seemed to come from Lieutenant Ferreira's bed. Matthias hurried down the dark corridor, and when he arrived, he found the soldier with his eyes closed, breathing heavily, and his lips forming the melody he had learned in the previous weeks. It was not a complete melody, just fragments, pieces of sound woven together imperfectly, but it was music coming from this man who had been destroyed by war. That silent moment between Matthias and Ferreira, illuminated only by the faint light of the moon coming through the high windows of the infirmary, was a turning point that no one had anticipated. Matthias remained motionless, practically holding his breath, afraid to interrupt the soldier's spontaneous act of resistance. Ferreira continued to hum, his eyes still closed, as if in a trance that transcended the infirmary, the war, the limitations imposed by his damaged body. When the melody finally ceased and Ferreira opened his eyes, he found Matthias there, and for a brief moment both understood something that official speeches could never articulate. The music had taken root so deeply that it could not be removed by the simple signing of a document. This was the evidence Matthias needed. It was not the observation of a doctor describing symptoms, but rather the spontaneous manifestation of a wounded soldier seeking the very medicine that had been denied him. The next morning, Matthias requested an audience with Colonel Ribeiro, and this time he did not come unarmed with arguments. He had spent the entire night documenting the incident with Ferreira, writing a clinical report that described the melody played, the soldier's breathing pattern, the changes in his pupils, all presented in a way that was as close as possible to the language of formal medicine. Ribeiro read the document with his glasses hanging slightly from his nose, his fingers drumming on the mahogany table. When he finally finished, he removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, as if procrastinating the moment when he would have to respond. But then something subtly changed in his expression. He spoke about his daughter again, something he rarely did. He explained that before she died, she played the flute. That music had been her way of escaping the horrors that a child in a city at risk of bombing would know. Ribeiro confessed that he had tried to overcome his grief by completely denying the value that music had in their lives, as if his daughter had never existed through her melodies. Colonel Ribeiro reorganized the memo he had sent. Instead of suspending the music sessions indefinitely, he created a pilot research program. Matthias would be officially designated as a researcher of applied therapeutic methodologies, a position created specifically for his work. He would be allowed to continue his sessions, but now he would also have the responsibility of documenting each result with scientific precision, using standardized forms that medicalized the process. It wasn't exactly the victory Matthias had imagined, but it was a resurgence of what had been taken away. The news spread through the infirmary like a warm breeze after a storm. The soldiers who had fallen into despair slowly began to rebuild themselves when Mateus reappeared with his portable piano and worn harmonica. But something had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just a man with musical instruments offering comfort. He was now a figure officially recognized by the military structure, which gave him a legitimacy that had been lacking before. Some of the soldiers joked that Mateus had become a soldier of bureaucracy, but even those jokes carried an underlying relief. If this story touched your heart, click thank you so that it reaches others who need to know that persistence and compassion can overcome even the most rigidly structured systems. True medicine, you will discover, has many faces. The resumed sessions were not simply repetitions of the past. Mateus had matured through the struggle he had faced. He now incorporated elements of scientific observation without sacrificing the artistic sensibility that had made the work effective in the first place. He created graphs showing the decrease in destructive behaviors after the sessions. He documented changes in the soldiers' sleep patterns. He recorded the number of words each soldier was able to utter, transforming silence into numbers that the medical community could understand. Soldier Cabral was perhaps the most dramatic case of transformation. Without hands, condemned by every doctor who examined him to live a purposeless existence, he began to communicate again through the musicalization of his body movements. Mateus discovered that if Cabral had simple music playing, he could move his body in a rhythmic pattern that was almost like dancing, as if the music was triggering neural connections that no aggressive physical therapy had been able to awaken. When Mateus documented this, he did not call it dancing. He called it synchronized motor response to structured sound stimulation. But the effect on Cabral was the same, a reason to continue existing. Gomes, the young soldier whose hypervigilance kept him in a state of constant alertness, began to develop what Mateus discreetly called enhanced gradual auditory tolerance. Through repeated exposure to predictable and controlled sounds in the form of music, Gomes gradually lost the startle reflex that haunted him. He still had nightmares. He still had days when the madness of war consumed him unexpectedly. But there was now a gap between the sound stimulus and his panic response, a space that was slowly expanding like a flower opening its petals. Lieutenant Ferreira, whose damaged lungs condemned him to short, labored breaths, discovered that long, sustained chants, which he had learned in music sessions with Mateus, forced his respiratory system to function in ways that traditional physical therapy could not achieve. It was not a cure in the traditional sense, as his lungs remained damaged, but it was a transformation of limitation into a different kind of strength. It was dignity slowly returning to a man who had been reduced to his condition. The entire hospital began to transform. Nurses asked Mateus to play during their rounds. Doctors who had been skeptical quietly began to request information about the work. Even the hospital kitchen, realizing that there were days when the soldiers ate better after the music sessions, began to allocate extra resources for meals on those days. The culture of the ward changed from a place of waiting for death to a place where wounded men were slowly, almost imperceptibly, being woven back into life. But Mateus's victory over military bureaucracy had attracted attention that was not entirely positive. A federal inspector arrived at the hospital in September 1944, sent from Brasilia to evaluate the efficiency of experimental programs in military health institutions. His name was Dr. Leocadio Oliveira, a man who carried a reputation for dismantling initiatives that did not align with established protocols. Oliveira was from the old guard of medicine, educated at European universities during a time when psychology was practically heresy, and the idea that something as ethereal as music could have therapeutic value was laughable. Oliveira spent 2 weeks at the hospital observing everything with the eyes of an auditor looking for violations. He interviewed the soldiers with a coldness that Mateus found disturbing, as if he were looking for loopholes in their narratives, evidence that the improvement they showed was just a placebo, pure illusion. He reviewed every chart Mateus had created, looking for methodological errors, problems in data collection, anything that could discredit the work. Mateus had never felt so vulnerable, so at the mercy of the judgment of a man who had already decided in his heart that no amount of evidence would change his predetermined position. During a particularly tense evening, Oliveira requested that Mateus formally present his work before a panel that had been convened, including Colonel Ribeiro, 2 other senior doctors from the hospital, and representatives from the regional military administration. The presentation would take place in the hospital auditorium, a place that was rarely used for anything other than military press conferences. Mateus prepared himself as a soldier would prepare for a battle he knew he might not win. He organized his notes, compiled his charts, and rehearsed his presentation a dozen times in his small apartment, while the sound of the ocean in the background reminded him of the vastness of what was at stake. The eve of the presentation brought with it a crisis that nearly destroyed everything. 2 of the soldiers who had made significant progress under Mateus's care, Ferreira and Gomez, had a violent confrontation in the infirmary. Ferreira, whose lungs were still functioning at a limited capacity, had begun singing a melody loudly during the night. Gomez, whose hypervigilance was still an underlying condition even after months of progress, interpreted the sound as a threat. In an episode that lasted perhaps only 2 minutes, he physically attacked Ferreira, leaving the lieutenant with a bruised face and an even more bruised ego. Mateus was awakened by the commotion at 3 a.m. When he arrived at the infirmary, he found both men being restrained by nurses, their bodies shaking, their eyes wild. The scene was an exact portrait of the kind of violent behavior Oliveira had been looking for, the perfect justification for dismantling the entire program. Mateus felt despair crashing against his chest like the waves against the rocks below the hospital. Everything he had fought for was about to be destroyed, not because of a lack of merit, but because of an incident beyond his control. If this story touched your heart, click "Thank you," so that it reaches other people who need to understand that even the greatest progress faces setbacks, and that true strength lies in the ability to continue even when all seems lost. Mateus spent the night with both soldiers. He didn't play his harmonica or bring his piano. Instead, he simply sat beside their beds in silence, his presence bearing witness to the pain they were both experiencing. Ferreira confessed that he had sung because he had had a particularly bad nightmare about his battalion being wiped out, and singing was his mechanism for dealing with the returning trauma. Gomes admitted that he had reacted out of pure survival instinct, a reflex that war had ingrained so deeply in his nerves that even weeks of progress could not completely deactivate. What emerged from this shared confession was a genuine understanding between the 2 soldiers. They weren't hurting each other out of malice or insanity. They were hurting each other because they were still trapped in the war, still fighting for their lives in ways that transcended the physical. Ferreira apologized to Gomez. Gomez apologized to Ferreira, and both looked at Mateus as if asking for permission to continue improving, even if the world insisted on defining them as irrevocably broken. When Oliveira was informed of the incident in the morning, his face revealed a sinister satisfaction. He immediately recast the event as a significant failure of the program, evidence that music therapy was not only ineffective, but potentially dangerous. Ribeiro, who had previously supported Mateus, now seemed less certain. Pressure was being applied from all directions. The presentation that had been planned to demonstrate the program's success would now serve as the final act of an experiment that would be dismissed as a failure. The morning of the presentation arrived gray and heavy, as if the weather itself were conspiring against Mateus. He left his apartment at dawn, coming off a sleepless night, his hands still trembling slightly from the coffee he had drunk to stay awake. The auditorium was filling up when he arrived. The audience, a mix of military officials in impeccable uniforms, doctors with expressions ranging from genuine hope to utter skepticism, and journalists who had been invited to cover what the military administration hoped would be a scientific success story. Mateus was about to begin his presentation when Colonel Ribeiro asked permission to make a brief preliminary statement. The colonel walked to the podium with a solemnity that filled the entire auditorium. He spoke about his daughter again for the first time publicly, telling the story of how she had brought joy through music before being taken away by the war. He described how he had seen that same joy begin to return to the eyes of men who had been condemned by traditional medicine to lives of despair. Ribeiro was not hiding his emotion, and the raw sincerity of his feelings created a contemplative silence in the room. Then Dr. Oliveira stood up. He also asked to speak. What he said was a meticulous dissection of every supposed weakness in Mateus's work. He questioned the methodology, pointed to the small sample size, discredited the metrics used. But more importantly, he brought up the violent incident between Ferreira and Gomez, describing it as exactly the kind of decompensation one might expect when traumatized men are encouraged to express themselves in unstructured ways. Oliveira argued that the program was not only ineffective, but also posed a safety risk. His conclusion was unequivocal. Music therapy should be discontinued, and resources redirected to more promising pharmacological investigations. Mateus sat through this entire dissection, watching his professional life being dismantled point by point. His presentation had not yet begun, but he could already sense that the battle was essentially lost. When he was finally given the floor, he stepped up to the podium with a calmness that surprised even himself. Instead of defending his work with scientific arguments, he did something that was completely out of protocol. He took his harmonica out of his pocket. The entire room fell silent. Journalists leaned forward. Doctors exchanged confused glances. Oliveira crossed his arms over his chest, his face showing an expression of disdain at what he obviously considered a theatrical capitulation. Mateus brought the harmonica to his lips and began to play a simple melody, the same melody he had played hundreds of times in Ward 7C. It was not a complicated melody. It was just a sequence of notes that any child could play after an hour of practice, but as it resonated in the silent auditorium, filling every corner with its almost sacred sound, something in the heart of every person present changed. When Mateus finished playing, he remained silent, the harmonica lowered. Then suddenly, the sound of a chair being pushed back broke the silence. Ferreira, who had insisted on leaving the infirmary to watch the performance despite his damaged lungs, stood up. With difficulty, breathing in short gasps that sounded like a broken bellows, he began to sing the same melody, his voice hoarse but recognizable. Gomes stood up next and began to sing as well, his teenage voice joining Ferreira's in an imperfect but deeply human harmony. Then another soldier from the infirmary stood up, and another, and another. One by one, a total of 8 soldiers that Mateus had worked with, all singing together, all alive in a way that no medication had been able to achieve. It was not a rehearsed performance. It was the spontaneous manifestation of men who had been healed not through drugs or procedures, but through the reminder that there was still beauty in the world. There was still reason to continue living beyond mere biological functioning. The entire auditorium was moved. There were tears on faces we would never have expected to see cry. Even Oliveira remained motionless, his expression of disdain finally gone, replaced by something that could only be described as forced understanding. At that moment, every argument about methodology, scientific rigor, statistics, and protocol disappeared, replaced by the raw and elementary truth that humanity had been restored in men who had been marked as lost. When the song ended and the soldiers slowly sat down again, the room remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. Then Colonel Ribeiro began to applaud. It was a solitary sound at first, but others followed, until the entire auditorium rose in applause that lasted for minutes. Mateus did not move from the pulpit, allowing himself for the first time in weeks to simply feel the relief of recognition. The months following the presentation were a period of tacit institutional transformation. Dr. Oliveira did not publicly retract his positions, but he also never appeared at the hospital again. His report to Brasilia recommended that the pilot program continue, albeit with caveats about the need for additional research. Ribeiro translated that bureaucratic language into simple administrative approval. Mateus's music therapy program not only continued but was expanded. 2 other musicians were officially hired and trained. The hospital's 2nd and 3rd wards were added to the program. Other military hospitals in the country began to be equipped with similar programs, with Mateus serving as a consultant and mentor. But more important than the institutional expansion was the individual transformation. Ferreira was transferred to a rehabilitation unit, where he continued his work as a counselor for other soldiers with lung injuries. He taught others how to use breathing techniques based on musical patterns to gradually expand their lung capacity. Gomes, whose hands had stopped shaking most of the time, volunteered to assist Mateus in the sessions, explaining to his traumatized peers how music had brought him back from the brink. Cabral managed to adapt to a series of functional prostheses, but he continued to attend the music sessions weekly. saying that music was the only thing that still made him feel like a whole man. Ward 7C, which had been a place of silent despair, was transformed into a space of tangible hope. National newspapers eventually covered Mateus's story and his revolutionary work. He received recognition from the international medical community, citations in academic journals that had previously disregarded him. But none of this external validation mattered as much as the simple fact that lives had been changed, that men who had been written off as lost were living again. The war ended in 1945, as the whole world knows. The soldiers in Ward 7C were eventually discharged, many of them returning to civilian life with scars that would remain forever, but with something critical that had been restored: dignity. Some of them wrote to Mateus years later, describing how they still played the harmonica occasionally, how they still heard the melody he had taught them in their minds, how they still turned to that music when the weight of their memories became unbearable. If this story touched your heart, commenting invites us to be part of a community of people who believe that compassion, when combined with courage and persistence, can transform even the most entrenched systems. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that there is always a way, always a light, even in the darkest of circumstances. Mateus grew old as director of the hospital's new music therapy department. His hair turned completely gray, his hands shook more often, but his eyes retained that depth of understanding he had developed through years of work. Young musicians came from universities across the country to train with him, to learn not only the techniques but also the philosophy that music was a language the body understood when the mind was too wounded to process words. In the 1950s, as the world began to try to forget the horrors of war, Mateus wrote a series of articles that were published in an emerging Brazilian medical journal. He described his work in language that was simultaneously poetic and scientific, attempting to honor both humanity and rigor. His writings helped pave the way for the formal acceptance of music therapy as a legitimate discipline within medicine. Universities began offering courses. Hospitals around the world implemented similar programs. But for Mateus, the greatest reward was never professional recognition. It was the quiet moments when a new soldier arrived at the infirmary, completely destroyed by trauma, and after weeks of silent listening while Mateus played his harmonica, it was seeing those first signs that humanity was returning, that the will to live was being rekindled. It was understanding that music was not a luxury or entertainment. It was medicine as real as any drug, as necessary as any surgery. It was the realization that when all else had failed, when bodies were shattered and minds were fractured, there was still a way home through beauty. One afternoon, late in his life, Matthew was sitting on the hospital porch, watching the ocean, when a man who had been a patient decades ago sought him out. The man was elderly, white-haired with visible and invisible scars, but his eyes shone with a peace that life had taken many years to grant. He hugged Mateus and said nothing, just held him as silent tears streamed down both their faces. There was no need for words. That hug contained a lifetime of gratitude, a whole narrative of being lost and found, of being broken and restored, not through technology or drugs, but through something as simple and yet as profound as one, man's willingness to sit with another and acknowledge his pain through beauty. Mateus, Albuquerque's life taught a lesson that military hospitals have learned well, that not all medicine comes in the form of an injection or a scalpel. Sometimes healing comes through frequencies that resonate in the chambers of the human heart. Sometimes being whole again means remembering that beauty still exists in the world, that life still has purpose, that there is still reason to go on when the body and mind simply want to give up. The months following the presentation were a period of tacit institutional transformation. Dr. Oliveira did not publicly retract his positions, but he also never appeared at the hospital again. His report to Brasilia recommended that the pilot program continue, albeit with caveats about the need for additional research. Ribeiro translates that bureaucratic language into simple administrative approval. Mateus's music therapy program not only continued but was expanded. 2 other musicians were officially hired and trained. The hospital's 2nd and 3rd wards were added to the program. Other military hospitals in the country began to be equipped with similar programs, with Mateus serving as a consultant and mentor. But more important than the institutional expansion was the individual transformation. Ferreira was transferred to a rehabilitation unit, where he continued his work as a counselor for other soldiers with lung injuries. He taught others how to use breathing techniques based on musical patterns to gradually expand their lung capacity. Gomes, whose hands had stopped shaking most of the time, volunteered to assist Mateus in the sessions, explaining to his traumatized peers how music had brought him back from the brink. Cabral managed to adapt to a series of functional prostheses, but he continued to attend the music sessions weekly, saying that music was the only thing that still made him feel like a whole man. Ward 7C, which had been a place of silent despair, was transformed into a space of tangible hope. National newspapers eventually covered Mateus's story and his revolutionary work. He received recognition from the international medical community, citations in academic journals that had previously disregarded him. But none of this external validation mattered as much as the simple fact that lives had been changed, that men who had been written off as lost were living again. The war ended in 1945, as the whole world knows. The soldiers in Ward 7C were eventually discharged, many of them returning to civilian life with scars that would remain forever, but with something critical that had been restored: dignity. Some of them wrote to Mateus years later, describing how they still played the harmonica occasionally, how they still heard the melody he had taught them in their minds, how they still turned to that music when the weight of their memories became unbearable. If this story touched your heart, commenting invites us to be part of a community of people who believe that compassion, when combined with courage and persistence, can transform even the most entrenched systems. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that there is always a way, always a light, even in the darkest of circumstances. Mateus grew old as director of the hospital's new music therapy department. His hair turned completely gray. His hands shook more often, but his eyes retained that depth of understanding he had developed through years of work. Young musicians came from universities across the country to train with him, to learn not only the techniques but also the philosophy that music was a language the body understood when the mind was too wounded to process words. In the 1950s, as the world began to try to forget the horrors of war, Mateus wrote a series of articles that were published in an emerging Brazilian medical journal. He described his work in language that was simultaneously poetic and scientific, attempting to honor both humanity and rigor. His writings helped pave the way for the formal acceptance of music therapy as a legitimate discipline within medicine. Universities began offering courses. Hospitals around the world implemented similar programs. But for Mateus, the greatest reward was never professional recognition. It was the quiet moments when a new soldier arrived at the infirmary, completely destroyed by trauma, and after weeks of silent listening while Mateus played his harmonica, it was seeing those first signs that humanity was returning, that the will to live was being rekindled. It was understanding that music was not a luxury or entertainment. It was medicine, as real as any drug, as necessary as any surgery. It was the realization that when all else had failed, when bodies were shattered and minds were fractured, there was still a way home through beauty. One afternoon, late in his life, Mateus was sitting on the hospital porch, watching the ocean, when a man who had been a patient decades ago sought him out. The man was elderly, white-haired, with visible and invisible scars, but his eyes shone with a peace that life had taken many years to grant. He hugged Mateus and said nothing, just held him as silent tears streamed down both their faces. There was no need for words. That hug contained a lifetime of gratitude, a whole narrative of being lost and found, of being broken and restored, not through technology or drugs, but through something as simple and yet as profound as one man's willingness to sit with another and acknowledge his pain through beauty. Mateus Albuquerque's life taught a lesson that military hospitals have learned well, that not all medicine comes in the form of an injection or a scalpel. Sometimes healing comes through frequencies that resonate in the chambers of the human heart. Sometimes being whole again means remembering that beauty still exists in the world, that life still has purpose, that there is still reason to go on when the body and mind simply want to give up.